I'd like to start by thanking the organisers for inviting me to this conference. It is always a great pleasure to be here in Seoul. The last time I was here was actually last October for the special meeting of the IPCC plenary, which approved the special report on 1.5 degree warming. And that meeting turned out to be a very, very successful one in promoting a positive debate around the implementation of the Paris Agreement. But today is what I would like to do is focus a bit more on the near term. I'd like to talk a little bit about what Australia's policy framework is, a little bit about some of our policy instruments that we have in place. And in fact, what I'd like to do is just focus on three key messages. First one is that the policy architecture chosen by countries to manage their emissions really does matter. So the Paris Agreement, as I'm sure many of you will know, is really quite flexible when it comes to describing how governments are to manage their emissions. Governments will be able to make many choices about how they do this, and the choices they make will go a long way to determining the effectiveness of the Paris Agreement. So I'd like to share with you some details about Australia's approach to how we will go about managing our emissions. It's a little bit more nuts and bolts than the previous presentation, and it would be what we would call MRV, really, monitoring, reporting and verification. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about our approach on those things. Second, while Australia's target is certainly a challenging target, I will highlight for you a couple of cases where the government has been very effective in designing policy instruments that have generated significant mitigation. So I will look at cases involving the deployment of renewable energies in the electricity system, and also the case of the land, which is very important for Australia. And third, I'll also touch on some areas where mitigation efforts have been less successful, perhaps in places where Australia might consider itself to be a technology taker. And I'm thinking here about the transport sector. So this is my presentation. Okay, first of all, a bit about the policy architecture that frames Australia's response. Australia's emission reduction target is ambitious and a responsible contribution to global climate action. The target is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. This target is consistent with the targets of other similar countries and mimics, by and large, the target established by the United States under the Obama administration. Under Australia's target, there will be deep reduction in Australia's emissions profile, and for example, this target translates into a reduction of per capita emissions of 50% by 2030, a 50% reduction in per capita emissions by 2030. Australia will use an emissions budget approach. Budgets are a sensible approach from the point of view of the environment, and because the atmosphere cares about every single tonne of emissions, not just those that happen in a target year. And it's sensible from an economic point of view. When you have large capital-intensive point sources of emissions, that can have a significant effect on your national emissions profile, and that's the case in Australia. Like Europe, Australia first committed to emission budgets under the Kyoto Protocol for both the first and second commitment periods, and an extension of those commitments provides continuity for our policy architecture. And we take a long-run view in our accounting against those budgets. In order to monitor and track our progress towards the emissions budget, we will seek to implement the best possible greenhouse gas inventory. And again, the choices that governments make do matter here. In Australia, we intend to ensure that the coverage of our greenhouse gas inventory is as complete as possible. So this approach makes us accountable and also maximises abatement opportunities. Completeness is a long-held idea in Australia. In Australia, we are a country that has never ever utilised nuclear power. But in fact, even with that situation, coal is only about 1/3 of our emissions profile. So it turns out that coal is only one part of the global warming problem. Electricity is only one part of the global warming problem. There are many, many other sources of emissions which must also be addressed if the Paris Agreement targets are to be met. So completeness is a very important principle for us. In Australia, we're going to broaden our emissions inventory. We're going to include all sources of emissions identified under the Paris Agreement in our inventory, and we will also seek to include some sources that go beyond what is required by the Paris Agreement. We aim to utilise as far as possible the IPCC's latest word on emission sources, which was released this year at the plenary in Japan in May. We intend to include in the coverage of our accounting, for example, sources related to coal exploration, to gas well decommissioning, to hydropower and water management, and also to blue carbon. So completeness is a very important element in our policy architecture. In addition, we also intend to use the IPCC's latest word on emissions estimation methods to invest in our science and data and to invest in our inventory IT systems. So this includes the Australian Greenhouse Emissions Information System, which is called AGIS, and FullCam, which is our IT system for monitoring emissions from the land. Timeliness of the information also really matters. So we want policymakers and our international partners to be informed of our latest emissions data. And to back up that idea, we're about to publish inventory data for the first quarter of 2019 in the next 2 weeks. Okay. We believe that confidence building measures in this field will be vital. Transparency is one important idea. We need to ensure that our partners understand our systems. And we would like to explore additional confidence building measures that could provide mutual assurance for monitoring data. The data used to track government commitments and make sure that that data is sound and reliable. It seems to me that as the world continues to warm, interest in the integrity of countries' emissions data will only increase. So I believe that the mutual assurance measures will quickly become more important and more available for us over time. Now I want to turn to a couple of case studies about policy instruments that have had significant effect in Australia. So the first case relates to renewables. So we are seeing a boom in the deployment of renewables in Australia. And this has largely been due to the government's scheme, the Renewable Energy Target Scheme, which requires electricity retailers to purchase 20% of their electricity supplies from renewable sources by 2020. On top of this, we also have one of the world's highest rates of penetration of solar systems on the rooftops of residential houses. In relative terms, the boom is quite significant. So we tell a story here. When we scale the investment in per capita terms, and I need to emphasise that per capita basis, Australia was a leading destination in 2018 for new renewables investment. So I guess renewable dollars per person in Australia, it was the highest of anywhere around the world. The strong growth in renewable supplies has come mainly from wind and solar and some hydro. So partly this is a question of design. So in Australia we have some reservations about the use of wood biomass. But mostly this is a question about economics in Australia. Wind and solar technologies are now very, very competitive. The future trajectory for renewables seems quite clear. We don't have a plan, as Anka just outlined, for the EU, but we are confident that renewables will likely make deep inroads into the Australian market by 2030, even without further government assistance. In fact, in Australia, the policy discussion has now shifted a little bit to revolve around security and reliability of electricity supply. So the Australian electricity system experienced significant blackouts in 2017, and I noticed that the UK suffered a blackout last week as well. So this means that the reliability of electricity grids is becoming an important policy issue, and one which is not straightforward to solve, and which will need careful management in the future. So the second example I want to talk about is the land. So just last week the IPCC released a special report called Climate Change and the Land, and in that report the IPCC estimated that globally emissions from the land account for around 13% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So it follows that reducing fossil fuels alone will not be enough to deliver global temperature targets under the Paris Agreement. In Australia, the land is an important sector, and government policy has been instrumental in delivering strong mitigation. So about 10 years ago, it was clear that sequestration and abatement efforts on the land will need government support, especially in order to devise the rules that define property rights, which allow abatement to be quantified and financial certificates to be issued and for trading to occur. So now projects to sequester or abate on the land can be undertaken by a project proponent. A market regulator provides assurance that the rules of the scheme have been met, and they issue what's known as an Australian carbon credit unit for these projects. So this process supports abatement and creates a supply of domestic tradable units. The demand for these units comes from two sources. So first of all, from the government, which purchases units through auctions. So government purchases of units, it's like a big subsidy for action on the land. And the other source is from private companies, as every major company in Australia must comply with an emissions cap, or else they must buy an Australian carbon credit to ensure compliance with their cap. So this has been, I think, a significant achievement for our mitigation action in Australia. Currently, the market price for the Australian carbon credit units is around $12 per tonne of CO2. The government recently renewed its commitment to this policy through its $2 billion Climate Solutions Fund, which it announced in the last 6 months. For Australia, this story on the land has been a successful one of a government-designed market instrument encouraging strong mitigation. So there are two examples of significant mitigation efforts where the good design of policy instruments has made a big difference. Third, I'd like to touch on a mitigation challenge for us. This is a chart of our transport emissions, 18% of our total emissions and growing. Since 1990, the population in Australia has grown by 50%, and as cars have become cheaper, car ownership rates have also risen. You can see that 30 years of climate debates have not made much of a dent in the growth of transport emissions in Australia. The red line shows where the emissions should be if transport was going to contribute to the national target on a pro rata basis. So what to do? In my view, the solutions to the transport problem will be very much technology driven. 100 years ago, the car makers of the world turned their collective backs on electric technology in favour of oil. Will they change back to electricity? Well, that time will tell. But I think, for me, one thing is very clear, is that as a technology taker, Australia has less influence on these transport emissions. And the future availability of competitive new technologies in the global car market, that will matter much more to the future outcome of our transport emissions. Okay, finally, just looking ahead, like others, Australia will be developing a long-term strategy to be completed by the end of 2020. We are currently exploring how other countries are using the development of their long-term strategies to consider issues around energy transition, trade competitiveness and the risks of carbon leakage, the use of international carbon markets and the socio-economic impacts of transition. We will be resubmitting an NDC next year and we'll be taking steps to design our policy architecture to ensure that our reported emissions reductions are also effective. In particular, on this last point, I would just like to come back and emphasise our intention to use emission budgets, comprehensive and complete approaches to equipping those budgets and building transparency for mutual assurance as the critical elements towards making our implementation of the Paris Agreement as effective as possible. Okay. Thank you very much, Chair.